Hey, welcome back everyone. We're again here broadcasting from my apartment, and we're continuing our coverage Monday through Friday, again 5 days a week, focused very heavily, at least for now, on this new coronavirus, the CCP virus. Now today we have a great lineup. We're going to be going into how the Chinese regime is escalating its threats and hostilities against the United States and some of the back and forth going on with that. We're going to be looking at some of the oddities in the Chinese economy right now, mixed reporting on it and trying to figure out what's really going on. And we're also going to be looking at this, let's say, clash between civil disobedience and new government controls trying to deal with this virus we're seeing taking place in the United States and other parts of the world right now. Now, folks, before we get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Again, we really need your support. And also those of you who have donated to the channel, I really appreciate it. I don't get to thank you all individually. I'm in some of the live chats, not always. And also I know some people donate afterwards on our donation platform. Really, genuinely thank you. It really helps us grow, and it's really because of your support that we're able to do what we're doing. So first off, we've seen patterns in the Chinese regime escalating its hostilities against the United States at this time. The Chinese regime, as we've mentioned before, is using a new form of propaganda they're calling wolf warrior propaganda. As we've mentioned previously, even their own advisors are saying that it's backfiring, it's not working, it's having the opposite effect. But the regime itself not only is not listening to them, but it is escalating its hostilities under this new platform. And so I'll go over a few of the headlines on this. Now, the Global Times, one of the Chinese regime's state-run media, has published an editorial. And when you see editorials with major state-run Chinese media, usually they're not really editorials. Usually they're basically statements from the Chinese regime, essentially. And so it said, China's countermeasures ready for prolonged war with U.S. Now, it is unlikely they're referring to an actual war as we mostly interpret it in the West. When they talk about war in this regard, they're talking about the war of words, they're talking about the war of factories, they're talking about the war of economics. They're talking about the war of narratives, the war of media, these types of things. And it does seem that they are moving forward with it. Epoch Times reported Beijing threatens retaliation after U.S. imposes new export ban on Huawei. The U.S. has banned Huawei from obtaining semiconductors made with U.S. technology. In other words, the chips that go inside things like smartphones and other high-tech devices. And this is a big deal. Huawei is one of the world's largest telecommunications companies, also one of the world's largest smartphone manufacturers. It is also one of the backbones of the Chinese Communist Party's One Belt, One Road initiative. Banning semiconductors from Huawei cripples that. To put this in perspective, there are generations of technology, and even a couple years make a huge difference. I mean, think about it. If you had a device that was set back even 5 years, let's say you have an iPhone 5 instead of an iPhone 10, most of us can say, yeah, it's a bit too old to compete on the global market. If you're selling a device basically on par with the iPhone 5 when everyone else has current generation technology, and that's only a 5-year gap. Now imagine if you were set back even further. You're selling these Nokia dumb phones, which actually are pretty good, to be honest, but point aside, imagine you're selling these Nokia dumb phones and you're trying to compete with the current generation smartphone. Obviously, the market is much larger for the current generation technology, and Huawei being denied the ability to use these chips inside of its devices means that it has pushed back generations. The Chinese regime cannot currently manufacture high-tech chips. It needs to import them. And so this is a crippling blow, not just to Huawei, but really to the Chinese regime's high-tech economy, and also its One Belt, One Road initiative. And it is notably threatening retaliation on that. And moving on. Reuters reports, China warns of countermeasures to new U.S. rule for Chinese reporters. Now, there's been a back and forth with the U.S. hitting on Chinese state-run media, and the Chinese regime retaliating with measures against U.S. media. It says the United States last week issued a new rule limiting visas for Chinese reporters to a 90-day period, with the option for extension. That takes effect on Monday. Such visas are typically open-ended and do not need to be extended. unless the employee moves to a different company or medium. Now, what can the Chinese regime really do in retaliation? The Chinese regime can ban different U.S. journalists operating in China. But notably, this doesn't really hurt the United States that badly. Because if you're in China, you have to follow Chinese law, at least to an extent, or you do get blacklisted anyways. In other words, journalists operating in China, American journalists and other countries' journalists, have limited freedom in terms of what they can or cannot say. And so, being there already, if they were to completely tell the truth, they would lose their visas. This has happened many times in the past. Epoch Times, for example. Notably, Epoch Times actually did have some Chinese journalists operating in China when we first started, back in 2000. They were all arrested. Our editor spent 10 years in prison, and they tortured him. And that's what happens if you're telling the truth in China, really telling the truth in China. And notably, even reporters like myself operating overseas, we've gotten threats. Our office in Hong Kong, for example, was firebombed very recently. And we've had many incidents like this over the years. And so, having these journalists who are already abiding to some degree with Chinese censorship laws in order to stay in China, getting kicked out of China, that is not a strong retaliation. The Chinese regime has fewer cards on the table to play in this battle. This is from CNN. It says, China is mobilizing its global media machine in the coronavirus war of words. Well, that could give some justification in terms of why these media that are being mobilized in a global media machine in the coronavirus war of words, according to CNN, might be having issues right now in terms of being called out. Now, moving on, there is mixed reporting right now on how well the Chinese economy is doing. And let's go over a few headlines on this. First off, New York Times. It says, coronavirus seemingly tamed. Chinese economy starts to recover. But let's dig into this article. Industrial production surged last month in China more than twice as fast as most economists expected, according to official data released on Friday by the country's National Bureau of Statistics. But retail sales fell even more sharply than anticipated, while orders for future exports from China have stalled. And it has a quote here from Liu Aihua, the Director General of the agency's Department of Comprehensive Statistics, saying, quote, the recovery of the production side may be slightly faster than the consumption side. It's this picture that the Chinese economy is recovering, the Chinese regime has the virus seemingly tamed, quote unquote, according to New York Times. A few different issues with this reporting. One is this is based on the analysis. This is based on the assumption, one, that the Chinese regime is telling the truth when it claims to have the coronavirus tamed. And news on the ground is showing otherwise. New cities are now going on lockdown. They're calling it the second wave outbreak. Again, it's arguable whether the first wave actually ended in the first place. There is news right now, as we speak, in fact, on how the Chinese regime is altering numbers on its economy. There's reports from China saying they're opening factories but they're not producing anything because other countries are not buying the goods. Now let's go back and look at this. 2019, South China Morning Post. And South China Morning Post is pseudo-influenced by the Chinese, not controlled by it. It's under Alibaba's Jack Ma. It says, quote, China's miracle economy has a secret ingredient, cooked GDP books. Why fear not making good that pledge about doubling the size of the economy when the figures can simply be massaged into place? They themselves acknowledge that the Chinese regime's numbers on its GDP and economic growth are not reliable, that the Chinese regime cooks its books, as it states, and that it massages the numbers to say what it wants. Market Watch. China's industrial deflation worsens. Fox Business. Trump orders federal retirement money invested in Chinese equities to be pooled. This is Bloomberg. Americans are giving Made in China the cold shoulder, noting that many Americans will no longer buy Made in China goods. This is in addition to U.S. pushbacks on Chinese economic theft, notably the Justice Department going after different forms of Chinese economic theft taking place through, say, U.S. universities, through the Chinese regime's Thousand Talents program, and through other systems like this. This is in addition to TikTok being banned by federal employees. The trade war fallout, again, the Chinese regime still reeling from the trade war before this whole virus outbreak happened. And also looming sanctions basically following on the heels of these different international investigations now currently going through. And in addition as well to countries like Japan and India realizing that having their manufacturing supply chains based in China is a threat to their ability to produce if the Chinese regime decides to shut down as it currently has. Every factor, just about every direction of the Chinese economy is being hit right now. How could we say, based on this, that the Chinese economy is doing fine and is coming back? All the information seems to point the opposite direction. Now, moving on to some stories from around the world, and very heavily in the United States. Now, a lot of different states have implemented different forms of social controls. Some have stronger lockdowns, some lighter lockdowns. Some are dealing with court cases, some are dealing with civil disobedience. And we hear noise about this, but I thought it'd be nice to go through some of the different headlines, some of the recent updates on this, and give a picture of where things are at. It is illustrating the difference between state law and federal law, that state governments are really the ones implementing these edicts, implementing these things that are not necessarily written law, but edicts, that you need to follow these different guidelines they put into place. And the question of whether this violates federal law, whether this violates constitutional rights, and whether people actually need to follow these laws that are not really written laws as of yet. It's a very unique situation we're in right now. And across the U.S., this is one of the major issues. And notably, it's not just the U.S. dealing with issues like this, but the whole world. But the difference between state rights and federal law is coming into play more heavily in the United States. Now, this is from the New American. New York City police won't enforce face mask rule following outrage over woman's rough arrest. You all may have seen the video of this woman who has a child with her who is arrested by police. Allegedly, she did have a mask, but she was wearing it wrong. The full context of that video is not clear. You never know with these videos taken by cell phones because oftentimes people start recording after the conflict has begun. But the police, many police officers are seen arresting this woman in front of her child. Child is crying, and it did not look well on the NYPD, let's put it that way. I'm willing to hear the whole story. Anyone has information that says otherwise outside of what we're being told, I'm all ears, leave it in the comments section. Being in New York myself, I have seen interesting phenomenon that a lot of people seem to be not taking the masks that seriously anymore, walking around, of course going to the office here and there. I do see about at least a third of people probably not wearing masks anymore. And notably in the parks, if you go to some of the parks, for example, this past weekend, there were some people who didn't have masks. The police were there. They were not arresting people for not having masks. Instead, they were handing out masks to people who did not have them. So the situation is shifting like that a bit. But at the same time, the local government here is not really backing down. New York Governor Cuomo is saying, no matter what was done during pandemic, older people were going to die. And now this ties into some controversy that's been happening with Cuomo. Cuomo facing a wave of criticism over a controversial mandate requiring nursing homes not to deny admission or readmission to residents based solely on a COVID-19 diagnosis, was told of a family who lost 2 relatives to the disease. Notably, Cuomo was allowing individuals who had the virus to still be allowed into these retirement communities. And many of the deaths that took place in New York were allegedly at these communities. And now, based on his actions, it is being assumed that many of the deaths could have been prevented had he not done that. Now, also in New York, and again, Epoch Times reporting, anyone swimming at New York City beaches will be, quote, taken right out of the water, and that's according to Mayor Bill de Blasio. Moving on to California, the Washington Examiner is reporting California sheriff won't enforce lockdown order, saying hands are full trying to rearrest accused criminals. Notably, California had freed many criminals from the prisons because allegedly they feared that prisoners were at risk of getting the virus. There have been some reports of people who were arrested for pretty serious crimes. There's a lot of pushback on that, people noting, well, you'll let prisoners out because you're afraid they'll catch the virus, but you'll put people in prison or in jail, not necessarily in California, but in other parts of the U.S., because they're not wearing masks or because they're reopening their businesses. There's a lot of contention around this right now in the US. Now, again in California, Epoch Times reports money for illegal immigrants in California starts being distributed. Each illegal alien can receive $500 in direct assistance if they qualify, with a maximum of $1,000 in assistance per household. A household is defined as individuals who live and purchase and prepare meals together. And notably, part of the requirements for getting this money is you have to prove that you are an illegal alien. And at the same time that they're giving $500 to up to $1,000 per household for illegal aliens in California, The Hill is reporting that Newsom, California governor, says federal government has a, quote, ethical obligation to send states funding amid coronavirus. This is one of the big contentious issues right now. The Trump administration is saying they will not give federal aid to states that are enforcing, for example, sanctuary city policies. One of the big issues is how the money is being spent when they give it to different states. And the idea that they're sending money to non-citizens and even illegal aliens, not just people who are immigrants, is a bit contentious when it comes to that. Now, being fair, we could argue that these individuals, some of them, of course, illegal aliens, are out of work just like anyone else in this country, many of them at least. Many of them do have families, and many of them may not have enough money to take care of themselves during this time. We could argue that if they are not given some money, what are they going to do? Some of them may have the option to go back to their countries. That is not always, of course, an easy process, just being fair to them. There's also the issue of many Americans not wanting to give benefits to people who are not citizens that even they themselves are not receiving. Of course, not everyone is receiving basic income like this. Some of us received $1,200, for example, from the federal stimulus for the virus, but that is not an ongoing thing. And so should non-citizens, and not only non-citizens, but again illegal aliens, in other words, not just normal immigrants, but people who have entered the country illegally, be entitled to benefits that even normal American citizens are not receiving. Now, when it comes to some of the debates around religious freedom, we have a story here from Oregon Live, and it states, Oregon governor's coronavirus restrictions on religious gatherings, social gatherings, null and void judge rules. Of course, many people have pointed out that this goes against constitutional rights that protect the freedom of belief and also the freedom of assembly. This is one of the big issues we're having right now of whether these laws violate constitutional rights. Now, moving on to Elon Musk. We've very likely heard that he is defying his orders to keep his business shut down in California. He reopened his factory. There's some protests around that, some different issues. Here's the update on that. Tesla's next factory is going to be in Austin, Texas, and he's moving on this very quickly. In other words, like many other Californians right now, Texas is looking like a mighty fine place to go. Moving on to New Jersey, this is from NJ.com. Gym reopens in defiance of New Jersey coronavirus lockdown with crowd of supporters waving flags, police nearby. In other words, right in front of the police, reopening this gym, people supporting it, police not intervening. Now, moving on to Europe, in France, a French judge has banned the use of drones in Paris that were being used to spy on people breaking these distancing rules. Notably, some different parts of Europe and some parts of the US, notably Florida, for example, some areas, have started using drones to enforce this. This is also something we saw being promoted by the Chinese Communist Party as part of their system for lockdowns. The use of these unmanned vehicles to go around and pressure people, sometimes over loudspeaker, if they go out on the street and violate stay-at-home laws. Back to the US. Now, MSNBC is reporting Trump declares vaccine or no vaccine, we're back, as coronavirus deaths approach 90,000. Notably, MSNBC, they have their own analysis and opinions on Trump, and so this is skewed in that direction, and so they're conflating Trump saying vaccine or no vaccine, we're back with the number of deaths.
It's very important. Vaccine or no vaccine, we're back. And we're starting the process.
Now, in China, Dubai, and Italy, new technologies are being put in place to enforce the lockdowns. This is from Business Insider. It says police in China, Dubai, and Italy are using these surveillance helmets to scan people for COVID-19 fever as they walk past and it may be our future normal. So these helmets these police are wearing, can scan people's body temperatures. In other words, these helmets have built-in sensors that can detect these things. One of the big issues we're going to have after this whole virus comes to a close, after the whole pandemic is over, is what systems stay in place and what systems are repurposed for other forms of, say, enforcement, law enforcement, smart city technologies, and things like this. It is questionable whether governments spending money to buy, for example, these helmets with built-in sensors are not going to try to repurpose them if they've already spent the money for it and they've taken it out of their budgets. We'll have to see what is left over once this whole thing is said and done with. Notably, in China, the Chinese regime has already been installing different forms of sensors very much like this as part of things like its social credit system, technologies to monitor and keep tabs on every citizen in the country. Using technologies like that outside of China, implementing things like this. Again, we'll have to see what the future implications of this are. And finally, the Epoch Times did an analysis of YouTube, something you all might find interesting if you've been seeing some of your comments apparently disappearing. YouTube automatically deletes some terms critical of Chinese regime. Now, the Epoch Times, for this investigation, actually tested these keywords itself to see how long it took YouTube to automatically delete them. Apparently automatically delete them, and we reports. One apparently banned phrase is gong fei, which can be translated as communist bandit. It seems to date back to the Chinese Civil War era. Another phrase that gets deleted is wu mao, which literally means 50 cents, and is commonly used to describe the army of internet trolls the CCP uses to spread its propaganda online. It's rumored the trolls used to be paid around 50 cents per post. So in other words, and of course they go over many different keywords that are now banned, that if you post them on YouTube in the comments section, your comment may disappear. Now on the term wu mao, or 50 cent, if YouTube is actually enforcing this, if YouTube really is knowingly deleting comments that state that, it means it is defending individuals who may be promoting Chinese Communist Party propaganda on its platform and who are being called out by other individuals for doing so. And also when it bans the phrase gong fei, it is banning criticism of the Chinese Communist Party. And notably, you can't argue this as a race issue because it's it's the Chinese term they're banning. In other words, Chinese and people speaking Chinese. Now that said, folks, what do you think of this? What do you think about YouTube banning different Chinese terms that are critical of the Chinese regime or pointing out the Chinese regime's use of, for example, paid internet trolls? Do you feel that these technologies may come to your country, whether it's the US or elsewhere? How do you feel about the different forms of lockdown in your communities? Do you feel they are necessary? Do you feel they are actually essential? Do you feel they're tyrannical? What is your analysis? Interested to see what you have to say. Now, that said, again, folks, please do not forget to like and subscribe. Again, we really need your support. And of course, folks, please take care of yourselves, stay healthy, and we'll see you next time.